Hi, welcome to Lit Africa Study, where we discuss all things African literature. Today we shall be discussing Peter Abraham's 1956 book, A Wreath for Udomo. This discussion will look at the plot of the novel and the novel's setting before we look at the major characters and how they are presented in the book. Lastly, the discussion will also detail the major themes that are explored throughout the book. And so before we go any further, feel free to grab a notebook and a pen so you can write notes as we go along. Now that you have your notebook with you, let's get into a quick summary of the book for those of you who are yet to read it. So, A Wreath for Udomo is set against a backdrop of Africa as it grappled and fought with European colonialism. The book thus traces the life of Michael Udomo, who is a young revolutionary from a fictional African country called Pan-Africa, and whose ideals are centered around freeing his country from British colonial rule and thus help in realizing the vision of African independence that he and his friends are chasing. The novel thus opens with Udomo living in London, where he is pursuing his studies, but where he is interested in meeting his hero, who is a fellow revolutionary and whose name is Tom Lanwood and who is also a writer. So Tom Lanwood also hails from Pan Africa. So while in London, Udomo, who we see is living in poverty but has a passion to realize a better Africa, is paired towards meeting his hero. He thus orchestrates meetings that lead him directly to Lanwood, and while there, he meets other revolutionaries and intellectuals including Paul Mabi and Adebhoy, who are his homeboys, and he also meets another revolutionary from the neighboring country of Pluralia, and his name is David Manti. The group quickly bands together and fight for the recognition of African independence amongst the London colonialists, and therefore what we realize is that the key thread bringing the group together is their desire to return home and lead their respective countries to freedom. While in London too, we see Udomo forming deep personal relationships with Europeans. Amongst his key European associates is Lois, a white English woman who becomes romantically involved with Udomo and supports his cause. Their relationship progresses well as Lois gives Udomo space to grow and uplifts him from his poverty. The two even go further to promise each other forever. But their relationship is short-lived because Udomo then goes to sleep with Louis's friend, whose name is Jo first, who then falls pregnant. And when Louis discovers that they were trying to get rid of the baby, their relationship ends. The breakup also causes a rift with other revolutionaries, particularly Udomo's friendship with Paul Mabi. Eventually, though, Udomo returns to Pan Africa after fellow exile Richard Adebhoy has been in the country for a while, mobilizing resources for Udomo's return. At first, upon his return, Udomo faces resistance from the local chiefs who refuse to be a part of the revolutionaries' work towards independence. In addition, Udomo struggles with the merchants who have funded his return home and his paper. This leads to failure and dejection on his part, as he knows that while Pan-Africans are ready for change and simply desire for someone to ignite it for them, as long as he does not have the funds for it, he will not be able to realize the dreams of independence for his country. So he visits Selina, who he met on the voyage back home, and the wealthy black woman who has extensive funds and a vast network of connections funds the explosive call to action that Udomo has written in his paper and also creates a network that will help spread the heavily censored paper across the nation. Udomo is then arrested after the publication of the paper, but the tides in Pan-Africa have changed as masses of people begin to rally behind him and the African Freedom Party is formed while he is in prison. After his release, elections are held and Udomo inevitably becomes the first black prime minister of Pan-Africa. He also faces challenges in filling his government as there are not a lot of competent individuals within the country who have the expertise to run a government. He then calls on his old friends who are in London, such as Lanwood and Mabi, to come and help him with government, and Menti to help him with his fight for independence in his native country of, wait for the tongue twister, Prularia. Okay, Prularia. But when this new government is formed, there are already tensions. The people are disgruntled at the government's slow pace in getting rid of the whites who remain in the country. Udomo is also leaning on the whites to help with the human, political, and financial capital to help industrialize the country. But this is met with resentment, not only from the people who had expected a total expulsion of white people from the country, but from his friends in government too, notably Adebhoy and Selina, who are revealed to have strong tribalistic tendencies. When Lanwood, Mabi, and Menti arrive, it is to a government that has tension. Udomo, however, helps Menti with his passage to Pluralia. And in setting up Mabi, who still bears a grudge to what Udomo did to Lois in a new government post in the mountains. Lanwood, however, struggles to fit in the new country and promptly disappears back to London. Tensions, however, and unfortunately, continue to escalate for Udomo as in his bid to industrialize, he relies on the expertise of the white people from Prularia. But this expertise is conditional, as Udomo is aware of Mendi's whereabouts, and the Prularian whites are looking for the revolutionary who is causing havoc in the nation. So in exchange of the industrialization of Pan-Africa, Udomo is forced to betray Mendi's whereabouts, leading to Mendi's capture and eventual passing. Unable to live with the guilt of betraying his friend, Udomo confides in Mabi, who is also grieving, and the two fight. In the meantime, the tribalistic tactics of the others in government continue to escalate, and Selina and Adebhoy are at the forefront of it. Then the two orchestrate the passing of Udomo, who is obliterated by his guards. The novel then ends with Mabi penning a heartfelt letter to Lois, lamenting the passing of Udomo, with Mabi thinking that perhaps he was complicit in it and he should have supported Udomo in the cause for ending tribalism. So guys, that's the summary of the book, and I hope that it helps those of you who were struggling to understand it. For those of you who are yet to read the book though, I do urge you to do so because it is super interesting and it will help you understand the following aspects of this discussion. Now that we have looked at the summary, we go on to the second part, which is the setting of the novel. Now, with regard to time setting, the book is set during a crucial period of transition in African history, where several countries were beginning to shed off the cloak of European colonialism and starting to embrace self-rule. Geographically, the novel shifts between two key locations, that is the fictional country of Pan-Africa and London, which is the capital of the Great Britain, and this shift is aimed at reflecting the dual influences on the protagonist's life that they experience rather in London and Africa. As such, in the early parts of the novel, we see Udomo, who is living in London where he is studying and where he also meets like-minded revolutionaries like Lanwood, Menti, Adebhoy, and Mabi. In London, the group participates in African nationalist movements that help to speak out against colonialism back home. London, therefore, in the book, is presented as a major hub for activism that allows the revolutionaries to strategize, debate, and form alliances with intellectuals and radicals. In addition, London also serves as the heart of European imperialism, and this helps shape Udomo's ideas of not just independence, but also democracy and industrialization. In contrast, the Pan-African setting represents Africa under colonialism. The country is presented as one that is rich in culture but also struggles under the harsh reality of poverty, colonial oppression, and underdevelopment. Africa is also further presented in rural villages and fragmented and unequal cities where there are difficulties first as nations attempt to balance the old ways with the need for modern progress. Finally, in terms of the political and social context, the novel occurs in the context of African independence movements that occurred in the 1950s. While the fictional country of Pan Africa is not real, it mirrors the conditions that many African countries existed in during that period. As such, this is aimed at speaking to the political upheaval, the struggle for independence, and the tension between the old and the new Africa. So that's just about it in terms of the setting of the novel. And should you encounter a question in class that asks you to analyze the setting of the novel, be sure to split it into three: the time setting, the geographical context, and the political and social context of the novel. I hope that will help. So we are moving on to the next stage of the novel, and this is one of the important parts that you might be examined on, and this is the characterization of the novel, and therefore we will discuss both the main characters and the minor characters in the book. The first character that we are going to be looking at is the protagonist, who is Udomo, whose importance to the story is seen in the mention of his name in the book's title. That highlights how important this character is to the shaping of the story. So from the beginning of the story, Udomo is portrayed as charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious, and that is easy for the reader to overlook his poverty and quickly help in understanding his desire to liberate his country from colonial rule. Again, from the onset, Udomo is depicted as idealistic, as somebody who has ideals that he wants to see in the end, and as somebody who has hopes for his nation. And this means that his time in London is largely expressed through his single-mindedness to liberate Africa from colonial rule. That is his main goal. That is what he wants to achieve, the desire for African independence. He also manages to marry his revolutionary principles with a desire for creating modernity while in London, which means that while he wants to liberate his country, he also wants his country to benefit from the modernity that the current world is undergoing. However, once we see him back in Africa, there is a dramatic transformation in his character as reality forces him to navigate the complexity of his newly found political power while ensuring that he does not compromise his ideals about the revolution. He, however, does understand that there is a need to get along with the colonialists in helping to rebuild Africa, but this further affects his relationships with his fellows. Now, despite being a revolutionary that is staunch, that is strong, Udomo also has several flaws that are consistent. First, we see a train of betrayals, from betraying his partner Lois, who he cheats on, for betraying Mandy to the colonialists, and for betraying Selina and Adebhoy by continuing to fraternize with the whites. These betrayals seek to highlight his fickleness in building and maintaining relationships despite his staunch revolutionary ideals. Udomo is also unwavering in his beliefs, and while this helps him become prime minister, it is also instrumental in isolating him from the other orchestrators of the revolution in Pan-Africa, as his belief that tribalism is a cancer is not communicated adequately to Selina and Adebhoy so that he can convince them to work with him. Now, another key character in the book is Lois, who is a major character in the first part of the novel, but is referred to multiple times in the novel's later part. Lois is a white English woman who becomes romantically involved with Udomo while they are both in London. She is a teacher and is presented as financially stable and is able to upgrade Udomo's status in the country. However, she represents both tension and support to Udomo's cause and helps to offer him intellectual support. On the other hand, her presence in his life seems to symbolize the complications and the contradictions between the African people and the European colonizers. In addition, we also see that Lewis's character also explores the complexities of interracial relationships within the context of colonialism, where personal feelings become political. Lastly, Lewis may be seen to represent the polarization, which is the separation that occurs or that can occur between black people and white people should relations be severed, as seen in his town's refusal to forgive Udomo, which I believe is justified, though you can't blame the girl. Now, another character that we'll look at and who I believe is significant is Tom Lanwood, who, although his character starts off strong, ends up significantly diminished. Lanwood is from the onset presented as the reason behind Udomo's dream to liberate Africa and as an intercessor between the colonial powers and the Africans back home. However, as the story progresses, he is seen to be out of touch with African affairs, and thus his greatness as a revolutionary diminishes. Further, we see that his failure to assimilate with the African culture upon his return to Pan-Africa weakens his character even more. Lanwood's character is therefore important in symbolizing how distance can affect perception, as after spending 30 years in London, he becomes out of touch with the African struggle and thus becomes more idealistic rather than practical. Then we move on to another character, and this is Selina, who we also see as another very key character in the story. From the onset, we see her being presented as a wealthy female entrepreneur who is in touch with her African roots, and she serves as the vision of a strong black woman through Abraham's writings. Also, despite acquiring wealth in her market, Selina does not distance herself from the poor blacks as some wealthy black and black intellectuals have done. In addition, her strength is seen in aiding two revolutions, the one in Pan-Africa and the other in Prularia. And this further reinforces the importance of the role played by the women in the struggle for African independence. But despite her strengths, we see that Abrahams also presents her as flawed as Udomo. First, she uses her strength to abuse those who are weaker than her. For instance, through giving Udomo and Mendi women to sleep with as prizes. Secondly, she's also presented as a tribalist, meaning that her disdain is not of people of one color, but is rather of people who have different beliefs, who have different backgrounds from hers. This means that Selina's weaknesses, much like Udomo's, highlight the flaws in the characters of even the strongest revolutionaries. Then the last three characters that I'm going to group together and who I think are also key in the book are Adebhoy, Mabi, and Menti. All three characters, just like Udomo, are African intellectuals who are based in London at the start of the novel and who have a desire to rescue their countries from European rule. All three were also in London before Udomo, and Mendi has already participated once in a failed revolution in Prulalia. Adebhoy, who is a fellow Pan-African with Udomo, is presented initially as a stalwart revolutionary who paves the way for Udomo not only in London but mostly in Pan-Africa, where he seeks funding for the new government, but is however later presented as a very power-hungry tribalist. Mabi, who is another Pan-African, while as idealistic as Udomo, is however also quite the traditionalist and does not take to Udomo's betrayals as lightly, although in the end he admits to understanding Udomo's vision. Menti, the only Prulalian, is however presented as a determined revolutionary who fought against colonial rule effectively till his end. The tale of these three revolutionaries is therefore important in highlighting the differences that were inherent amongst all the revolutionaries and their intentions after independence, despite the thread of African liberation that united them. So that brings us to the end of the major characters in A Wreath for Udomo. We shall discuss some of those characters together with the minor characters in the next part of this analysis, which is the thematic analysis. But before we get to the themes, please do not forget to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, and also let me know what books you are studying so I can help you in reviewing them. Now, after you've clicked like, after you've subscribed, after you've left a little comment down there, we can now turn to the thematic analysis. So the themes are very important in this analysis because they help to understand how the struggle of African independence was shaped. We are going to be looking at these themes separately so that should you just want to focus on one, then you can just skip quickly to it and focus on that theme in particular. So firstly, the theme on which Abraham premises A Wreath for Udomo is colonialism and its impact and its aftermath on African continents as a whole. Colonialism is portrayed throughout the book as not just a system of political and economic exploitation, but also a force that has affected African societies and cultures. Now we turn on to highlight some of the specific instances in which colonialism is portrayed in the book and how it is portrayed. Firstly, the justification for colonialism is seen through the many reasons given by colonialists to conquer Africa. Colonists such as Roseley and Smithers argue that the colonization of Africa was largely because of the desire for conquest, as conquest has largely been a part of previous empires such as the Roman Empire, of which Britain had once been a colony. As such, the colonization of Africa was all part of the consolidation of power by stronger countries from Europe, regardless of the desires of conquered nations. In addition, continued colonialism was defended from the position that African masses were disorganized and thus would not be able to handle the advancements that had been necessitated by the colonizers. Further, the colonists feared that the revolutionaries would take away the gains of colonialism and benefit from them without being a real benefit for the masses. What, however, is the main thread amongst the reasons for African colonialism is the desire for the colonists to retain power and thus consolidate their empires. It is Mabi, however, who dismisses these reasons for colonialism when during a press conference between the colonist and the exiled colonized, he aptly says the extension of colonialism was not good for Africans. His reasoning is therefore that it is not up to the British to determine when colonialism should end, as the colonists have noted that they will relinquish power once they are satisfied the colonized are fit to run their own affairs. For Mabi, therefore, this indicates a level of superiority on the part of the British, who do not believe that black people are capable of running their affairs. As such, for the exiled revolutionaries, the reasons for colonialism are seen as unjustified. The impact of colonialism is seen early on through Menti, who has been displaced and who has had to live in exile because of the uprising that is as a result of colonialism. Back in his home country of Pluralia, Menti attempted to revolt, but this led to slaughter which inadvertently affected him and led him to fleeing to the safety of London. As such, there is displacement, highlighting that colonialism has the power to alienate people from their homes and their lands. In addition, despite the polarizing nature of colonialism, it further serves to separate families and their possessions. Mendes' wife is annihilated and finished off by the revolutionaries after she refuses to move from her home. Further again, when Mendy returns home from London to fight for Prularia's independence, he is unable to reach out and see his children, who he has not seen for years, and this is because he fears they will be used as pawns by the colonists and thus ensnare him. As such, this means that colonialism is depicted as alienating the colonized from their homes, their lands, and their families. Colonialism is also presented as having a long-lasting impact on the colonized. When Louis Udomo and Mabi visit Louis's inherited home on the continent of Africa, they encounter the once invaded Saracen ruins. Mabi, whose mind is interested in getting rid of the colonists, notes that he is happy that the invaders eventually left. However, Louis points out to him that the invaders' presence is still felt in the darkness and temperament of the once invaded people and in their music. This highlights that even after the colonists leave, there still will be scars for the nations. The novel further depicts the several ways that are used to subjugate people. Colonists in Pan-Africa and Prularia use a variety of tools to ensure that colonialism continues to work. One of those tools is the quelling of conflict, as black people are not given the chance to rise against the colonial powers. For instance, when tribal people in Pan-Africa attacked the district commissioner, there is a police force that is sent there to subdue dissent, thus diluting the black voice. Secondly, taxation is also used to fund the colonists' rule, and this is meant to make the people pay for the policies that are put in place by the colonists, thus further making the colonized forever indebted to the colonizers. Dissenters are also denied access to their homes, and Smithers, who is the chief secretary of the colonist government, says that Lanwood is to remain in London for as long as possible, and again this is aimed at ensuring that his ideas are not heard by the people in his home country. In addition, imprisonment is also used to silence people, and as such imprisonment is mainly reserved for those who are masterminds in the revolution. For instance, when Udomo publishes his explosive paper that calls on people to rise against the government and be free, he is imprisoned. Furthermore, extermination in courts is also used to silence the people, and this is seen in Mendy when the white pluralists end him because of his role in igniting fire amongst the pluralists against the government. This therefore highlights that colonialism is supported by systems and practices that further seek to subjugate the colonized. So again, guys, that's it on colonization. Just remember that the novel not only helps to highlight how colonialism is justified, it also looks at the impact of the phenomenon together with the methods used by the colonists to maintain power. Okay, so now we move on to the next theme, and the theme that we want to explore is one that is closely linked to the theme of colonialism, and that is the theme of race or racism. The novel plays a huge role in explaining race in the context of colonialism through highlighting the complexities of racial identity in the fight for African independence. And let's now try to unpack how race is portrayed throughout the book. So Abrahams, throughout the novel, makes it clear that there is a divide between black and white people. As such, the relationships between the blacks and the whites in the novel are strained and are characterized by a lack of cooperation between the two races. For instance, when Udomo meets a young white peer who seems to be interested in the revolution, Udomo asks him what kind of cooperation there can be between blacks who are slaves and whites who are masters. These sentiments are also echoed by Menti, who refuses for a white man to be on their side of the revolution, thus delineating the revolution as being either on the black side or on the white side. This then highlights how the racial divide may work to divide people, even though they may want the same thing, where both the oppressed and the unoppressed want justice and freedom. Their different positions in society often leads to disagreements as to how to get where they want to go. As such, when whites prefer diplomacy, blacks may prefer fighting as a means of ending the revolution. Again, we see racism through separation, that is, the segregation of people according to the color of their skin. Throughout the novel, white people occupy positions of superiority when compared to their black counterparts. This is seen in the ship that Udomo takes back to Pan Africa from London, where the first class is full of white people and the few black people in there sit in isolation at one table. In addition, within the first class section of the ship, the servers or the waiters are all black, and this highlights how labor rests within black people. In addition, within the first class section of the ship, the servers, that is the waiters, are all black people, and this highlights how labor rests within the hands of black people. Furthermore, there is a reference to servers as steward boys, further perpetuating racism through making it seem like black people never grow to manhood and thus remain boys despite their ages. Also, another important aspect to note about segregation within the ship is the lack of white people within the third class compartments. This then highlights that white people are superior to black people within society and within the context of the colonialism period. The segregation and separation of black and white people is also seen in the preferential treatment between or towards white people, even within the black community. In Pan Africa, white people who are foreigners and who are in the minority stay in the richer parts of the capital of Queenstown. Where the poor blacks live in one part of town, the wealthy whites live along the slopes of the hill in homes that resemble English country homes. Despite having similar ranks with the black elites, however, the black elites stay in another part of the city. The segregation of housing within the city helps to highlight how race separates people from each other. Further, the preferential treatment given to white people is seen through the treatment of blacks and whites should they be receiving the same service. For instance, as Udomo disembarks the ship into Pan Africa, he notices how the black sergeant stamps the passports of the white individuals first before he turns to the black people. What this means is that black people are continually seen as racially inferior to white people and thus are usually subjected to less favorable treatment. There is also an interplay between race and power that is highlighted in the novel, and this is seen through the power that the whites retain over the black people, even when the power should be within the black people. After the success of the Africa Freedom Party's revolution, Udomo wins, right? The party also gets 51 of the 60 seats in the new government. However, instead of Udomo forming the government, it is Rosalie, the colonist governor, who calls the Africa Freedom Party to form a government instead of vice versa. The colonists are therefore more interested in preserving power even though they have lost the elections, thus leaving power in the hands of the minority whites, further highlighting the impact of colonialism. This interplay between race and power is further seen in the relations that Udomo, once he becomes prime minister, has with his staff. As prime minister, he now has a white secretary and a white server, and this role reversal gives him power, highlighting the desire to conquer each other's races between black and white people. However, Abrahams also refuses to point out all black and all white people as racists, thus refusing to stereotype the relations. The writer points out that even among the settlers, that is the colonists, there are some who are ashamed of the misuse of power by white people. Rosalie, for instance, is seen to be ashamed of how the whites in Ralia blatantly use their race to achieve domination over black people. This, therefore, can be seen as highlighting that racism is not collective, but is individual, as the desire for racial superiority can differ from one person to the next. These examples are thus important in helping us to understand the different ways in which race and racism are portrayed throughout the novel. What is therefore important for you to remember should you encounter a question about race in your classes are the three main points: poor relationships between blacks and whites, segregation along racial lines, and lastly, the relationship between race and power throughout the novel. The next theme now that we want to talk about is the theme of power, which in itself is linked to the themes of colonialism and racism that we have already discussed. Throughout the novel, Abrahams explores the internal and external power struggles faced by the characters as they sought African independence. So for the purposes of this discussion, I will try here to look first at the external struggles and then the internal struggles that are related to the theme and that are, of course, portrayed throughout the novel. The theme of power, firstly, is expressed externally in various ways. The struggle for independence, while there are prominent figures such as Udomo and others, is also the struggle experienced by ordinary people in Pan-Africa who are also willing to see the liberation of their country. This is seen when the people of Pan-Africa continue to fight for independence even after Udomo has been imprisoned. The Pan-Africans take a stand to join the Africa Freedom Party that the imprisoned Udomo started, and further they pay a shilling each, and the 10,000 of them are able to fund the party. This is important in highlighting that the masses were also interested in liberation and thus were willing to sacrifice the little they had for the struggle. In addition, this point is important in highlighting that the struggle was not just for a few individuals, but for all that were involved. The external struggle for independence is also seen through the isolation of independent from dependent countries by colonizers. Countries such as Pan-Africa cannot be seen to get along or to fraternize with countries such as Pluralia that are still under colonial rule. Although Udomo and Menti have been friends since London days, Udomo tells Menti that he cannot support the uprising in Pluralia as prime ministers should not be seen as aiding revolutionaries in colonized countries. This isolation of countries therefore highlights complete control that white colonizers have over the colonized countries. Menti, on his part, also highlights how the struggle for independence was also carried out. In his first revolution, there was violence which led to a carnage. However, the fight against colonialism was not evident the second time for Menti, for he chose to use disruption tactics to ensure that the whites did not remain in power. This was done through breaking down power lines, conducting strikes, and seeking ways through which to incapacitate the current government. Udomo, on the other hand, used tools such as his paper to call for an end to colonial rule. Underground networks such as those conducted by Selina were also pivotal in driving the struggle. As such, revolutionaries and individuals used various tools to fight for the emancipation or the revolution of Africa. The external struggle for power is also seen through the loss of agency that revolutionaries experience once they are elected into positions of power. One way in which the elected revolutionaries lose their agency is when their rights have been taken away. For instance, within the Africa Freedom Party, marriages between the party leaders and any white women have been made illegal. Another example is seen when Udomo tells Mende that he is often forced to make deals with people he despises, seeing as he now leads the country. What this highlights is that revolutions have the power to alienate revolutionaries from the real world through taking away their agency if what they do is seen as no longer saving the revolution. As such, more power in some aspects means the stripping off of power in other areas. Revolutionaries thus have to play the balancing act that forces them to please as many people as possible, often to their own detriment or even at the expense of their dreams or the ideals that they had. Now, we look at how power is expressed internally. While the majority of the black characters within the book all want to be rid of colonialism, Abrahams highlights that they have different interests, which may thus clash with the desire for colonialism, as it may be difficult to consolidate efforts towards liberation. When Adebhoy arrives in Africa, he expresses his disgruntlement with the chiefs and particularly with their lack of interest in working with the revolutionaries in fighting for freedom. Instead, the elders are noted as being interested only in their positions and in being invited to government parties. Adebhoy also notes that they are corrupt and thus their role in the struggle is worthless. This highlights that even amongst the people that we see are oppressed, all the people have different motives and power needs, thus making the struggle for liberation difficult. These differences in power needs is also seen to manifest differently amongst the colonialists. Abrahams highlights that the colonists have different ways of thinking and thus of handling colonial matters. Older colonists such as Jones are portrayed as holding dear the importance of the legacy of founding fathers and thus trying to maintain relationships with the colonized. However, the younger colonists, such as Smithers, who took colonial posts, are seen as more interested in the salaries they receive as civil servants and are thus not in tune with what goes on within the communities. Furthermore, the colonists all have different views regarding how to rule and treat dissent within their communities. Smithers and the governor, for instance, agree that Udomo should not be arrested for publishing his explosive paper. This is because they know that despite the orders from London to arrest dissent, they are aware of the changes in the environment and want to act according to those changes. What this highlights, therefore, are thus the different views and attitudes of people who are in power. The theme of power is also seen internally through the personal motivations of the different characters, which in turn helps to solidify their fight against colonialism. Individual power is seen through Udomo's martyrship towards the revolution. Udomo shows that he is not scared of being imprisoned or even remaining in jail for as long as there is still a belief in the cause. Udomo actually verbalizes to Selina that he would die for the people. This self-sacrifice, which also highlights his resilience, is a symbol of internal power that is harnessed not only for the self, but for the greater good of everyone else. Now, another important point to note under the theme of power is that power also manifests negatively amongst the characters and mostly from an internal perspective. This is because the leaders of the revolution often find themselves unable to separate the political power and personal powers that they have. For instance, when the Africa Freedom Party is formed, Udomo is made the leader, president, and chairman for the rest of his life. This means that the power he now has will remain uncontested, and this somehow seems like double standards, considering that the colonial powers also have uncontested powers. In addition, the power that Udomo now possesses allows him to see the people who have joined the party as largely subjects rather than real humans. This is seen when Menti and Lanwood arrive from London and Udomo tells them to wave at the party, not because they should greet the people, which is a sign of respect, but because the people will like it. What this highlights is that power can make people lose sight of what has driven them previously solely because they are now in power. So that's it for the theme of power, and depending on how you want to look at it, the characters in the novel itself depict power struggles from an internal and external perspective. Now we move on to the next theme, which is one of the major themes that belies the novel, and that is the theme of gender, and which is my favorite theme in the entire novel. Gender roles and power dynamics between men and women are extensively touched on by Abrahams in the novel, and this is shown in various ways. The first point is that gender roles are clearly defined throughout the novel, with men taking on more broader roles, particularly in societal and political spaces, while women's roles are mainly domestic and okay in the home. For instance, from the very beginning of the novel, female characters take on homely roles or are expected to take on homely roles, and this is seen when Lois and Joe go to the kitchen to prepare tea while the men remain in the living room talking about political issues. This is also apparent when the men are in Lanwood's home discussing the relationship between imperialists and colonialists while Mary Feld is in the kitchen. Menti also hints at this when he talks about his wife and emphasizes that a woman is responsible for her lord, who is her husband, thus highlighting an imbalance in power during marriages. When he, Menti, later returns to Africa and finds a companion in Maria, he dissuades her from joining him in the jungle where he is fighting the colonialists from. He tells her that the jungle is not a place for women, thus effectively domesticating women. The separation of roles for men and women thus signifies a divide between them, further pointing to a lack of space for women in other places rather than the home. Another important point connected to the theme of gender in the novel is the silencing of women's voices in the struggle. Despite colonialism affecting all Africans, male and female, the roles and the voices of women in the struggle are seen as unimportant. For instance, when Mary Feld voices her opinion on the revolution and argues that the revolution is not a preserve for men only, Lanwood dismisses her through stereotyping all women as emotional. What is ironic about this is that Lanwood is also fighting against imperialism and does this from the perspective of the colonized, yet he is blind to the oppression and disdain with which he treats women. What is worse is that he is unaware of his oppression of women because of the superiority that masculinity presents to him. From Abraham's viewpoint, therefore, the struggle for independence is ironic as it serves the men while forgetting the women. Now, another perspective in which gender is viewed throughout the novel is the representation of women as weaker than men. This is seen, for instance, when Udomo speaks about the colonization of Africa and says that it makes them seem like they are not men. He thus likens colonization to emasculation as it strips men of their manhood. Udomo also portrays women as weak because they are emotional. As such, he denigrates any sign of emotion in men as weakness because it is feminine, according to him. For instance, when Mabi insists on resigning after Udomo's betrayal of Mendi, Udomo calls him a sentimental woman, thus attempting to emasculate him and make him feel like less of a man because of his emotions. This then means that there is a certain standard of behavior and strength that is expected of women, and when they fail to exhibit this, they are seen as weak as women. Another way in which women are presented as weak is seen through the infantilization, that is, the treating of an adult like a child, of Maria by Menti. In the majority of their interactions, Menti constantly refers to Maria as my child. This, in my opinion, is not only predatory, but it puts women in a position where they are seen as incapable of thinking and of acting in the same manner as adults. All these factors thus work together to portray women as weak throughout the novel. Now, gender is also portrayed through the dependence that men and women have on each other. Women, on the one hand, are seen as incomplete when they do not have a man by their side. For instance, Lois feels safe when Udomo is around, as she highlights that a woman is not safe and complete unless there is the protection of a man around her. Similarly, Udomo feels incomplete without Lois, noting that he feels incomplete without her. But despite this dependence on the way in which the roles of men and women complement each other, men continue to have a superior role over women. And this is seen when Udomo tells Lois that every woman needs to have a man, making it seem as though it is just women who cannot live without men and not vice versa. Abrahams also explores identity in gender. This is seen when women often lose their identity to men during relationships. For instance, Mabi accuses Lois of turning Udomo into a god and then having her life revolve around him. What this highlights is that women get too attached to men, and thus this will lead them to losing their identities. Another example of women losing their identities to men is seen through Maria's constant need to please Mandy. Maria herself verbalizes that she does have a desire to have finished school, but that desire is not for herself. Instead, she notes that she would have continued with her education so that she would understand Mandy's interests and so she cannot lose him. For Maria, therefore, getting an education would not be meant to serve her, but to serve the interests of the man she loves. What this brings to the fore is that women do not often do things for themselves, but instead have their characters enmeshed in their lovers' characters, thus losing their agency. Another major way in which gender is presented is through the commoditization of women in the novel. Commoditization, for those of you who do not know, is the taking away of value from something and making it something to be bought and sold, just like any produce in a shop. So women are thus treated as commodities in the story. This is seen, for instance, when Selina gives the men who have come from London, that is Udomo and Menti, women to sleep with so they can reconnect to the motherland. This is effective in stripping women of their power and making them second-class citizens when compared to their male counterparts. Maria, who is the woman given to Mandy by Selina, further highlights this when she tells Mandy not to thank him when he expresses her gratitude for telling him that it is the duty of a woman to do what she can to please her lover. As such, this highlights that women exist at the behest of men. The commoditization of women is also seen through Mandy, who appreciates Maria's sexual skill, as he has only been with circumcised women from his culture. What this shows is that women are treated in a manner that seeks to please society and not themselves, thus stripping them of their value. Now, to counter the otherwise negative portrayal of women throughout the novel, Abrahams does present women as being important in the struggle for independence. This is done mostly through the character of Selina, who is seen as a kingmaker. Selina, from the start, is presented as wealthy and thus able to fund the revolutionary cause. She is also presented as relatable because she is someone on whom many people can identify with as she sells in a market. Besides her characterization, however, Selina also highlights the importance of women from the get-go when she tells Udomo not to forget women, as they are often overlooked by revolutionaries. Adebhoy also acknowledges the importance of women in the struggle when he admits that Selina is the real power behind the party, as she holds massive influence over the women, who in turn have influence over their men. See the irony there? As such, Adebhoy concedes that without her, there would be no party and therefore no independence. While Selina is by no means perfect, what Abraham succeeds in doing is highlighting that phrase or proverb that behind every successful man is a woman. As such, women are seen as integral in the fight for independence. Another interesting point to note under the theme of gender is that men are also portrayed as weak, thus highlighting flaws in their superiority over women. For instance, Lewis states that women are freer than men because they do not have to partake in dangerous activities, which is a sign of male strength as women are expected to be soft. Lewis then continues that white people are freer because they are not burdened by colonialism, while black people have to fight for their space in the world. What this means is that while black men are stronger than women, they are not stronger against colonialism. Another example is Lanwood's constant emasculation by Merrifield. While Lanwood is initially presented as a strong authority figure in the revolution, he is dependent on Merrifield, and this serves to further emasculate him. As such, the lack of power amongst men can be seen as emasculating, thus affecting their role in the struggle. So that rounds up our discussion of gender, and it is such a major theme in the book. I do hope that from this discussion, should you be asked about the theme of gender in your class, you will be able to at least articulate it from this discussion. Now, to move on, another major theme is the theme of betrayal, and the book itself is based on betrayal, from the betrayal of loved ones to the betrayal of brotherhood and sisterhood, and finally, the betrayal of the cause of revolution. So, firstly, let's talk about the betrayal of loved ones in the book. Perhaps the major and most heartbreaking betrayal for me is when Udomo betrays Louis by sleeping with Joe first, who is Louis's friend. What is worse is that Udomo then refuses to take accountability when he realizes that Joe is pregnant by calling the baby somebody else's and referring to Joe as a stupid girl, even when he actively participated in the intercourse. As such, he does not only betray Lewis, but he also betrays Joe, who falls pregnant by him. Looked at from the perspective of the entire novel, and even from the perspective of life, what Abrahams therefore attempts to highlight is that even well-meaning revolutionaries, well-meaning men, well-meaning women may fall by the wayside and be distracted from their causes. However, an interesting and yet ironic point is that at some point, Udomo thinks to himself that he cannot have intercourse with Merrifield because he could not do that to his friend Lanwood, yet he did the same to Lewis. Secondly, there is the betrayal of brotherhood and sisterhood. We have already touched on Joffre's betrayal of Louis, but another painful betrayal is that of Udomo to Mendi. After Udomo has become the leader of Pan-Africa, he is put in a position where he has to choose either the industrialization of Pan-Africa or the betrayal of his friend Mendi, who is trying to get Prulalia, which is still under colonial rule. Please forgive me for my pronunciation of that word. My tongue, guys, sorry. While from the very start of the story, Udomo and Menti are very close friends, the betrayal stands firm as the betrayal of ideals and dreams that had been concocted in London by the young idealists. What, however, makes the betrayal worse is that it did not come from a place of unkindness, but because it came from a place of either losing a friend or losing the gains of the liberation struggle. Similarly, Selina and Adebhoy feel betrayed by Udomo because of his fraternization with the whites. For Selina, Udomo has brought more whites into Pan-Africa than there were before independence, while Adebhoy feels that Udomo has not done enough to end segregation in Pan-Africa. Udomo refers to both Selina and Adebhoy as part of Pan-Africa's past. This betrayal symbolizes how power can corrupt and thus make people who were friends turn against each other. There is also a betrayal of the struggle that is highlighted throughout the book. One instance is seen after the publication of Udomo's paper, with people across the country reading the paper to each other and doing this even so despite a heavy police presence that aims to reduce the spread of the paper. However, it is a black police officer who uncovers the readings and makes arrests, highlighting that people can turn on each other. Another example is seen through Dr. Njura, who is part of the black elite and who, after realizing the power of the uprising stirred by Udomo, attempts to change the discourse by bargaining for shared power between the colonial powers and the African elite. Dr. Njura is therefore prepared to gain something from the uprising, even at the expense of everyone else. As such, these betrayals highlight that revolutionaries may turn against one another to seek either personal glory or personal gain. So that's it for the theme of betrayal, which then brings us to our next theme, the theme of tribalism. Tribalism, which refers to the act of people unifying as a result of coming from the same tribe, is highlighted by Abrahams as a cancer affecting Africa in the aftermath of colonialism. Throughout the book, there are several instances where tribalism occurs, and I shall list them here. Firstly, there are power struggles between peoples, and these are largely driven by the failure of the new government to balance tribal loyalties against national loyalties. This means that there are people who have to be in government based on their tribe and not on merit. For instance, when Udomo becomes the prime minister, Mabi decides he is now the super tribal chief, hinting that nothing has changed in terms of tribal relations. As such, tribalism is another great struggle within Africa, where different tribes attempt to push different agendas and thus assert superiority over others. Secondly, tribalism is presented as divisive in the same manner as racism is. According to Maria, it is impossible for Udomo to marry a woman who is not from his tribe, even if it is a black woman, because the people from his land would not want that marriage. So what tribalism does is remove any relationships or affiliations that one has with people outside that tribe, thus making it difficult for fraternization, which is the mingling together, amongst peoples of different tribes. The impact of the theme of tribalism, therefore, is that Abrahams show that the end of colonialism paved way for the beginning of tribalism, which was an even bigger threat to Africa due to its discrimination and favoritism even amongst black peoples. So with that said, I think those are the major themes that this book is premised on. Now we look at some of the minor themes within the book. Firstly, one of the minor themes is the theme of poverty, and this is seen through the various characters and how they are portrayed through characterization. Udomo, while he's in London, is presented as poor and unable to afford meals, and this is despite his drive to revolt. Menti, who is also in London, wears old shoes. In addition, despite their apparent poverty in London, they are also of poor folk back in their lands, and this is seen through Udomo, who remarks that he comes from a village where people have not been to school, and that he is only the second boy to go to school in the village, and therefore everyone else is simple and ignorant. What this highlights is that the inability to afford an education also breeds further poverty. Another example of poverty is seen through the circumstances of Udomo's life in Pan-Africa, where he is now forced to work in a threadbare office and where he wears suits, which according to Selina, no longer fit. What these examples of poverty highlight in the book relate to the lack of control that people in poverty have. As such, despite the lofty ideas that Udomo and his fellow revolutionaries have when it comes to the liberation, their lack of funds makes it difficult for them to carry out their dreams, particularly with regards to the revolution. This in turn leads to a dependency on those those that have funds, but who might have differing interests. For example, the merchants who own the printing plant and whose funds finance Udomo's paper, and who thus can tell Udomo what and when to print as they have the resources. As such, poverty throughout the book is seen to breed powerlessness. Another theme that is minor in terms of portrayal, but on which the book is premised, is the theme of love. Love is an underlying theme throughout the story as it transcends from the love of one's country, that is patriotism, to the love of brothers who are fighting the same ills, that is the strong brotherhood, particularly in London, between the revolutionaries, and finally, romantic love. Udomo and Louis's romantic relationship is at the core of the book, with the two falling for each other in spite of their different socio-economic backgrounds, where Udomo is black and poor and Louis is white and rich and actually owns land in Udomo's motherland. While all these instances of love eventually suffer from the cruel fate of betrayal between brothers and between lovers, the theme is really the thread that holds the book together. What I also noticed under the theme of love, and this is my opinion, is that for the revolutionaries themselves, though they loved their countries, they also loved the West and its ideals. I find Louis's character in the story to be symbolic, as both Mabi and Udomo feel tied to her, as Landwood feels tied to Field. Their attachment to white women thus seems to be a preference for Westernism, but again, that's just my opinion. Abraham also highlights family and community to be at the core of the book, and thus it is one of the themes within the story. African communities are seen as largely oriented towards collectivism, that is, working together as families. This is seen in Pan-Africa, for instance, where families put together funds to buy cars for their sons so the sons can become self-sufficient as taxi drivers. Another example of community is seen in the market, where traders, especially women, would only bring a few wares to their stores, but then spend the rest of the day socializing with others, and this therefore symbolizes togetherness. This sense of community is also seen at a political stage, where the struggle against colonialism is a collective battle for all involved, and this is seen through the networks that Mendy has set up in Pulalia, where there are committees responsible for distributing food and stores to help in the war effort. What this highlights, therefore, is that African communities are united by nature and therefore work together to drive towards communal goals. There is therefore no individualism within the communities. Another minor theme that Abrahams also expresses is the theme of belonging. The revolutionaries struggle to fit in London, and this is largely as a result of their skin color. However, belonging is also expressed through Landwood, who neither belongs in Pan-Africa nor in London, because he is a Creole, that is someone who belongs to two different languages or races. And the new black majority government has not made any effort to accommodate people like him. And therefore, despite having played a large role in the revolution, he finds himself alone while in Pan-Africa. He feels therefore that he does not belong to the new Africa. As such, the revolutions only benefited black Africans and maybe even some white people, but left out the needs of others who were Africans but who were not black. Abrahams also explores the theme of capitalism, although to a lesser extent. Once Udomo is in power, he has to balance the interests of the newly independent Africans with the desire to industrialize the nation. However, industrialization comes at a cost, as it is mainly driven by the white interest and is it benefits the white capitalist. This then leads to a conflict of interest as the Africans believe that industrialization will force them to be reliant and dependent on white people again, and thus the gains of the revolution will be forgotten. As such, Abrahams points out to the delicate balance that African leaders had to navigate post-independence to ensure that the gains of both colonialism and independence were not lost. Lastly, the book also looks at the interplay between expectation and reality, and this is largely shown through Udomo. At the beginning of the book, Udomo is fired up and has big dreams about freeing his country and therefore creating a society that will ensure all Africans thrive. He is thus dedicated to this cause and is willing to make personal sacrifices such as leaving Lois behind. However, as he rises to power, he is faced with the desire to not only appease his people but also to drive the country forward, and because of these decisions, he suffers internal dissent and the pressure to maintain control mounts on him spectacularly. Through Udomo, therefore, Abraham portrays that revolutionaries should not be narrow-minded when attempting to change the status quo, but have to take into account the fact that the world would have changed, and thus even with new power, they have to maintain a balance that embraces change and furthers that change. So these are the major and minor themes that Abrahams explores in the novel A Wreath for Udomo. I do hope that this session has been helpful for you. If you think that I've missed some important points, please be sure to put them in the comments so that others can benefit from them too. Also, do let me know what other books you're starting in school, and I'll be sure to look for them and add them to this channel. I am working on the notes of the book, and once I am done, I will link them below. For now, goodbye and lots of love. See you in the next session. Do not forget to subscribe. Do not forget to like. And please do leave a comment, even just to say thank you. Bye.